We're going to be reading chapter 10 from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The spell begins to break. Hope you're enjoying our trip to Narnia for spring break. Now we must go back to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and the three older children. As soon as Mr. Beaver said, "There's no time to lose," everyone began to bundle themselves into coats, except Mrs. Beaver, who started picking up sacks and laying them on the table and said, "Now, Mr. Beaver, just reach down that ham, and there's a packet of tea, and there's sugar and some matches, and if you will get 2 or 3 loaves of the crock over there in the corner." "What are you doing, Mrs. Beaver?" exclaimed Susan. "Packing a load for each of us, dearie," said Mrs. Beaver very coolly. "You didn't think we'd set out on a journey with nothing to eat, did you?" "But we haven't time," said Susan, buttoning the collar of her coat. "She may be here any minute." That's what I say," chimed in Master Beaver. Get along with you all," said his wife. "Think it over, Master Beaver. She can't be here for a quarter of an hour at least." "But we don't want to be as smart as we possibly can get," said Peter. "If we're going to reach the stone table before her, big of start as we possibly can get. If we're going to reach the stone table before her." "Remember that, Mrs. Beaver," said Susan. "As soon as she had looked in here and finds we're all gone, she'll be off at top speed." "That she will," said Mrs. Beaver, "but we can't get there before her whatever we do, for she'll be on a sledge and we'll be walking." "Then we have no hope," said Susan. "Now don't you get fussing, there's a dear," said Mrs. Beaver. "But if we get half a dozen clean handkerchiefs out of the drawer, because we've got a hope. We can't get there before her, but we can keep under cover and go by ways she won't expect. Perhaps we'll get through." "True, that's true enough, Mrs. Beaver," said her husband, "but it's time you were out of this." Why don't you start fussing either, Mr. Beaver," said his wife. "There, that's better. There's 5 loads, and the smallest for the smallest of us. That's you, my dearie," she added, looking at Lucy. "Oh, please do come on," said Lucy. "I'm nearly ready now," answered Mrs. Beaver at last, allowing her husband to help her into her snow boots. "I suppose the sewing machine's too heavy to bring?" "Yes, it is," said Master Beaver, "a great deal too heavy. And don't think you'll be able to use it when we're on the run, I suppose." "I can't abide the thought of that witch fiddling with it," said Mr. Beaver, "and breaking it or stealing it, as likely as not." "Oh, please, do hurry," said the 3 children. And so at last they all got outside, and Mr. Beaver locked the door. "It'll delay her a bit," he said, and they set off, all carrying their loads over their shoulders. The snow had stopped, and the moon had come out, and when their journey began. They went in single file, first Mr. Beaver, then Lucy, then Peter, then Susan, and Mr. Beaver last of all. Master Beaver led them across the dam and on to the right bank of the river, and then along a very rough sort of path among the trees, right down by the river bank. The sides of the valley, shining in the moonlight, towered up far above them on either hand. "Best keep down here as much as possible," he said. "She'll have to keep to the top, for you couldn't bring a sledge down here. It would have been a pretty enough scene to look at through a window from a comfortable armchair, and even as things were, Lucy enjoyed it at first. But as they went on walking, as the sack she was carrying felt heavier and heavier, she began to wonder how she was going to keep up at all. She stopped looking at the dazzling brightness of the frozen river with all its waterfalls of ice, and at the white masses of the treetops, and the great glaring moon, and the countless stars, and could only watch the short little legs of Mr. Beaver going ped, 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 ped through the snow in front of her, as if they were never going to stop. The moon disappeared, and the snow began to fall once more, and at last Lucy was so tired that she almost fell asleep walking at the same time, when suddenly she found that Master Beaver had turned away from the river bank to the right, and was leading them steeply uphill into the very thickest bushes. And then she came fully awake when she found that Master Beaver was just vanishing into a little hole in the bank, which had almost hidden under the bushes until you were quite on top of it. In fact, by the time she realized what was happening, only his short flat tail was showing. Lucy immediately stooped down and crawled in after him. Then she heard noises of scrambling and puffing and panting behind her, and in a moment all 5 of them were inside. "Wherever is this?" said Peter's voice, sounding tired and pale in the darkness. "I hope you know what I mean by a voice sounding pale." It's an old hiding place for beavers in bad times," said Mr. Beaver, "and a great secret. It's not much of a place, but we might get a few hours' sleep. If you hadn't all been in such a plaguey fuss when we were starting, I'd have brought some pillows," said Mrs. Beaver. It wasn't nearly such a nice cave as Mr. Tumnus's, Lucy thought, just a hole in the ground, but dry and earthy. It was very small, so that when they all lay down, they were all in a bundle of clothes together. And what with that and being warmed up by their long walk, they were really rather snug. If only the floor of the cave had been a little smoother. Then Mrs. Beaver handed round in the dark a little flask out of which everyone drank something. It made one cough and sputter a little and stung the throat, but it also made you feel deliciously warm after you'd swallowed it, and everyone went right to sleep. It seemed to Lucy only the next minute, although it was really hours and hours later, when she woke up feeling a little cold and dreadfully stiff and thinking how she would like a hot bath. And then she felt a set of long whiskers tickling her cheek, and saw a cave, and saw the cold daylight coming in the mouth of the cave. 1 minute while I quiet my tongue. But immediately after that, she was very wide awake indeed. And, so was everyone else. In fact, they were all sitting up with their mouths and eyes wide open, listening to the sound, which was the very sound they'd all been thinking of, and sometimes imagining they had heard during their long walk last night. It was the sound of jingling bells. Mr. Beaver was out of the cave like a flash the moment he heard it. Perhaps you think, as Lucy thought for a moment, that this was a very silly thing to do, but it was really a very sensible one, for he knew he could scramble to the top of the bank among the bushes and brambles without being seen, and he wanted above all things to see which way the White Witch's sledge went. The others all sat in the cave waiting and wondering. They waited nearly 5 minutes, and then they heard something that frightened them very, very much. They heard voices. "Oh," thought Lucy, "he's been seen. She's caught him." Great was their surprise when a little later they heard Mr. Beaver's voice calling to them from just outside the cave. "It's all right," he was shouting. "Come out, Mrs. Beaver. Come out, sons and daughters of Adam. It's all right. It isn't her." This was bad grammar, of course, but that is how beavers talk when they are excited. I mean, in Narnia, in our world, they don't usually talk at all. So Mrs. Beaver and the children came bundling out of the cave, all blinking in the daylight, and with earth all over them, and looking very frosty and unbrushed and uncombed with their sleep in their eyes. "Come on, Mrs. Beaver," cried Mrs. Beaver, who was almost dancing with delight. "Come and see. This is a tasty knock for the witch. It looks as if her power is already crumbling." "What do you mean, Master Beaver?" panted Peter as they all scrambled up the steep bank of the valley together. "Didn't I tell you," answered Mr. Beaver, "that she's made it always winter and never Christmas? Didn't I tell you? Well, just come and see." And then they were all at the top and did see. It was a sledge, and it was reindeers with bells on their harnesses. But they were far bigger than the witch's reindeer, and they were not white, but brown. And on the sledge sat a person whom everyone knew the moment they set eyes on him. He was a huge man in a bright red robe, bright as holly berries, with a hood that had fur inside and great white beard that felt like foamy waterfall all over his chest. Everyone knew him because you see people of his sort only in Narnia. You see pictures of them and hear them talked about even in our world, the world on this side of the wardrobe door. But when you see him in Narnia, it's rather different. Some of the funny pictures of Father Christmas in our world make him look jolly. But now that the children actually stood looking at him, they didn't find it like that. He was so big and so glad and so real. And they all became quite still, and they felt very glad, but also solemn. "I've come at last," said he. "She has kept me out for a long time, but I have got in at last. Aslan is on the move. The witch's magic is weakening." And Lucy felt like running Lucy felt running through her a deep shiver of gladness that you only get when you are being solemn and still. "And now," said Father Christmas, "for your presents. There is a new and better sewing machine for you, Mrs. Beaver. I will drop it at your house as I pass." "If you please, sir," said Mrs. Beaver, making a curtsy. "It's locked up." "Locks and bolts make no difference to me," said Father Christmas. "And as for you, Mr. Beaver, when you get home you will find your dam finished and mended and all the leaks stopped with the new sluice gate finished." Mr. Beaver was so pleased that he opened his mouth very wide and then found he couldn't say anything at all. "Peter, Adam's son," said Father Christmas. "Here, sir," said Peter. "These are your presents," was the answer, "and they are tools, not toys. The time to use them is perhaps near at hand. Bear them well." With these words he handed to Peter a shield and a sword, and the shield was the color of silver, and across it there ramped a red lion, as bright as a ripe strawberry the moment when you pick it. The hilt of the sword was gold, and it had a sheath and a sword belt and everything it needed, and it was just the right size and weight for Peter to use. Peter was silent and solemn as he received these gifts, for they felt of a very serious kind of present. "Susan, Eve's daughter," said Father Christmas, "these are for you." And he handed her a bow and a quiver full of arrows and a little ivory horn. "You must use the bow only in great need," he said, "for I do not mean you to fight in battle. It does not easily miss. And when you put this horn to your lips and blow it wherever you are, I think help of some kind will come to you." Father Christmas. Last of all, he said, "Lucy, daughter of Eve," and Lucy came forward. He gave her a little bottle of what looked like glass, but people said afterwards it was made of diamonds, and a small dagger. "In this bottle," he said, "there's a cordial of the juice of one of the fire flowers that grows in the mountains of the sun. If you or any of your friends is hurt, a few drops of this will restore them. And the dagger is to defend yourself in great need. For you also are not to be in battle." "Why, sir?" said Lucy. I don't know, but I think I could be brave enough." "That is not the point," he said, "but battles are ugly when women fight. And now," here he suddenly looked less grave, "here is something for the moment for you all." And he brought out, I suppose from the big bag at his back, but nobody quite saw him do it, a large tray containing 5 cups and saucers, a bowl of lump sugar, a jug of cream, and a great big teapot, all sizzling and piping hot. Then he cried out, "Merry Christmas, and long live the true King!" and cracked his whip, and he and the reindeer and the sledge were all out of sight before anyone realized what had started. Peter had just drawn his sword out of his sheath and was showing it to Master Beaver when Mrs. Beaver said, now then, don't stand there talking till the tea's cold, just like men. Come and help carry the tray down and we'll have breakfast." What a mercy, I thought, of bringing the bread knife. So down the steep bank they went and back to the cave. And Mr. Beaver cut some of the bread and ham into sandwiches, and Mrs. Beaver poured out the tea, and everyone enjoyed themselves. But long before they had finished enjoying themselves, Master Beaver said, "Time to be moving on now." The end. Where did Peter, Lucy, Susan, and the Beavers hide for the night? And who did they meet? Who did Mr. Beaver meet when he heard a sledge and sleigh bells? And what were the gifts given to everyone? All right, we'll see what happens in the next chapter, Aslan is Near, tomorrow.